She put me in the kitchen at my son's wedding. I stayed quiet for a reason. The sentence sits in my throat like a stone and has for years now, but that night it was fresh and hard. I remember the weight of the folding chair under me, the thin metal frame pressing into the back of my legs, the way the seat made a small squeak every time I shifted. A tray of shrimp cocktail rested on my knees, chilled beads of condensation running from the paper cups to the hems of my fingers. Through the swinging kitchen door, I could see the reception, lights soft and warm, a sweep of mauve chiffon on a woman who was not me, a tide of faces I had fed and dressed and worried over for 28 years. My name was nowhere on the program. You should know this before anything else. I had written the checks. I had signed the deposits and handled the invoices, the venue, the flowers, the band, the dress Daniel's fiancé would wear. I had arranged and paid for all of it. It is a curious thing paying for a party and feeling suddenly invisible on the night it arrives. My contribution disappeared into the smooth choreography of someone else's celebration. My hands were busy holding shrimp. My eyes watched a son I had raised become a stranger amidst paper confetti and toasts. The kitchen smelled of garlic and olive oil, salt, and something sweet caramelizing on a sheet pan. There was noise, the clink of utensils, the hush of a prep cook seeking quiet, the muffled laughter of guests beyond the swinging door. Every so often, a waiter would pass with a tray and offer me a smile, as if the presence of the old woman sitting by the prep sink were part of the decor. Someone's sleeve brushed mine, and I smelled cologne, lemon from a drink, and the faint ghost of the perfume Emily favored when she thought I wasn't looking. I had chosen the mauve chiffon for a reason. It was a nod to the mother of the bride dresses I'd never worn, a color that would not scream but would not disappear. It was a small thing, but I had wanted to look presentable. The dress fit like a memory, and when I caught my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator, I surprised myself with how composed I looked. That composure was a thin film. Inside me, wires twined tight around the part of me that had been trying for decades to be the good, quiet center. He was handsome in his black suit, the same jawline as his father. Daniel moved like a man on a stage that matched someone else's choreography. He smiled during the toasts, lifted Emily's hand, and at times glanced in the direction of the kitchen as if someone might emerge and say something complimentary. They did not call my name. The officiant spoke about families becoming one. There were flourishes of applause and a long, elegant kiss. There was a photograph of the two of them posted on my phone when my cousin squeezed the screen into my hands. I looked at it, felt my thumbs cool from the shrimp cocktail, and folded my hands into my lap. I tell you all of this not because I want you to hate them or to stack indignation in neat piles. I tell you because the particular humiliation of that evening is important to what came after. There is a sting to being excluded from a thing you made possible. It carries a kind of clarity. You see not only what was taken from you, but how thin the foundations of your assumed place were. For years I'd assumed that devotion, the quiet labor of nights spent sewing hems and mornings making sandwiches, and the stream of checks left on the kitchen counter, bought me something like visibility. That night taught me otherwise. When I think back, there are little images that collect like coins in my pocket. Daniel at 6, hair crooked after a sleepover, claiming his arm as a pillow. Daniel at 12 in a hockey jersey that smelled like sweat and triumph. The late nights when his son's fever rose and Michael and I traded shifts. The sound of my son's breathing slow like a metronome in the dark. Those images used to be the whole map of my life. They were not small things. They were the rioting and the calm. They were sacrifice rendered into everyday acts, teaching him to tie his shoes, staying up to help with essays, the endless laundering of everything. I thought I believed the marriage between time given and gratitude expected. I was naive, or perhaps I was stubborn in my hope. There is a ledger in the back of my mind, an arithmetic of what I had loaned and what I had done. It is not the kind of accounting that reads like greed. It's the quiet domestic mathematics of a mother. The braces I negotiated payment plans for, the winter coat that stopped a cough, the small gifts that stitched holidays together. I never kept those numbers as bargaining chips. I kept them as proof to myself that I was present. That night, someone folded the numbers flat and carried them out with the napkins. I stayed where I was in the kitchen because I believed, for now at least, that some days are not meant to be refashioned by one's anger. Daniel's wedding was his day, even if the ledger said it had been mine. I did not want to spoil a photograph or say something that would let the sound of my voice become a headline on his wedding album. There is a strange generational code among women of a certain age. You grit, you hold, you do not call attention to the parts that hurt. We nod through things. We become experts in minimizing. I had been that kind of woman, and that night I performed the role with a steady, precise calm. At one point, a cousin tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "You're being missed," with a softness that was little more than commentary. I smiled, I nodded, and the kitchen door swung. If you're watching this and this hits a nerve, if the taste of marinara or the squeak of a chair sets a memory loose, subscribe if this story resonates with you. Tell me where you're watching from. It helps to know we're not the only ones who've practiced silence into a habit. After the cake, which tasted of too little sugar and too much ceremony, after the dance that everyone, the young and the old, had been coaxed into, I left the hall under the tide of congratulations and slid into the hotel room that had been booked for me because politely they thought you might like a place to sit. The room was small and smelled faintly of lavender and another woman's hairspray. I remember the bedspread was a hospital blue, and the television had been left on, a silent rectangle of soft light. I took off my shoes and let the warmth in my feet spread into every knuckle joint, like thawing. It was there, sitting on the edge of that bed with the mauve chiffon pooled around me like a dull halo, that I opened my phone and the world shifted on its hinge. Michael had handled most of our bills before he died. He kept things in red folders, labeled and folded the way some men fold a map. After he passed, I tried to be like him, organized, steady, but with less knack for numbers and more for sentiment. I had been paying the place of wedding deposit from savings and then the invoices out of a bank account we'd used for years. It had seemed enough. That evening, as I opened my bank app, I wasn't looking for anything in particular. You do not plan indignity. It arrives like a wrong note in a familiar song. My thumb scrolled and the transactions resolved into neat columns. There were payments I recognized. There were payments that did not ring a bell. My fingers hovered. The charge from the caterer had a memo line that simply read, "Deposit, Daniel and Emily." There were amounts I hadn't imagined. My immediate thought was that perhaps it was a mistake, an extra guest, a security deposit, a last-minute upgrade. I tapped to see more. My screen revealed an invoice with a different name on it, and next to it, a screen capture circulated among a group of women that I recognized from the bridal shower. In it, a line of text that had been sent like a joke. "Don't worry, his mom is covering everything. Wink." It landed like a book dropped from a high shelf. I sat there, the fabric of my dress whispering on the bed, and watched the room tilt for a moment. That little wink, the semicolon and the closed parentheses, was a punctuation of dismissal. It contained in tiny symbols everything I'd felt all evening, the invisibility, the assumption, the expectation that my purse would never stop. Something inside me made a soundless, incredulous laugh that had no joy in it. The laugh was a private, slow-burning refusal. I did not shout. I did not stomp to the reception and throw my purse down with a theatrical flourish. I did what I have done most of my life. I moved deliberately. I checked 2 more things. I opened a payment portal and cross-referenced the vendor invoices. I did not want to believe that the people who had known me the longest, my son, the woman he had just married, the bridesmaids I'd once made tea for, had conspired or even casually assumed that I would be the bank behind their celebration. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to wake up and find that this was a misunderstanding. The numbers did not permit that luxury. A few hours later, in the pale blue light of the hotel room, with the television showing a garden variety late-night talk show in the background, I made the first of 3 calls that would change the next 24 hours. They were small administrative calls, no fireworks, no threats, no grandstanding. It was a list I had made in my head as the party music thudded and the city cooled outside. The florist, the band, the bar. These were the services that extended past the hour of the cake, the small things that would be seen the next day in photographs, strings of flowers that would be unpacked and left to wilt, a band that might call to collect the balance, an open bar that would leave its glassware and tabs in its wake. Cancel them and you do not erase the night. You simply refuse to subsidize its echo. The florist answered on the second ring. It was a young woman with a voice that leaned toward professional politeness. "Hello, good evening, Bluebell Florals?" "Yes," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "This is Margaret Hunter. I need to cancel the delivery scheduled for the following day." There was a pause like a small intake of breath, the kind you hear before someone reaches for their notes. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hunter. Let me see. Are you calling about the centerpieces?" "Everything," I said. "Please cancel the morning delivery, the rehearsal bouquet, and the extra corsages." "Okay, I'll just pull up your order." Her fingers clattered across whatever keyboard she had. "It looks like the deposit was taken last week." "Hold the refund," I said. "Refund will be fine. Please confirm that the balance will not be charged." "Yes, of course. We'll reverse." "I don't want apologies," I said. "I want it clear that there will be no additional service after midnight. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Hunter. I'll mark the order as canceled." There was no triumph in her correction, only the routine adjustment of someone following instructions. When I hung up, the phone felt cooler in my hand. The next call was to the band's manager. He picked up quickly, delighted to hear how the night had been from a parent. "Margaret," he said, "Daniel's people said everything went flawlessly. You were instrumental in—" "I need to cancel the return engagement," I said, and the sentence flowed like water from a faucet I'd finally opened. "No encore tomorrow, no balance due. Please cancel the hold and return any unused fees." He tried charm. "Mrs. Hunter, we could play the brunch." "Not tomorrow. No additional sets, no brunch, no bill. Done." He mumbled apologies, the kind that sound like a rehearsed script meant to soothe with no actual remedy, then confirmed the cancellation. I moved on to the bar company. The person who answered sounded as if she had been standing in the tent all night, a phone pressed between shoulder and ear, lipstick smudged in the same way my mauve dress might have been. I asked her to remove the extra hour and to pack the stations. I told her to make sure the bartenders had the instructions to reconcile their receipts internally. I told her to refund whatever remained. She thanked me with a sincerity that sounded almost relieved. It was all very small. It was all very precise. It was the kind of thing a woman who has been taught to manage chaos instinctively does when she decides she will not be used again. I sat back on the hotel bed and let the thrumming in my chest slow. There was no sense of victory. The cancellations were administrative. They were not revenge. They were a stripping back of the afterimage. I was not out to humiliate in public. I was out to remove my resources from being consumed without acknowledgement. Before I turned off the light, I took one more step. There is a photograph of the check, a grainy image my hands took as if to capture proof. It was not meant for spectacle. It was meant to be a ledger entry in my own memory. Here is what I did. I posted it with one sentence under the image, not to incite, but to state. The caption was a breath. I paid for this. The picture hung on my small social feed like an unassuming fact. People reacted, some typed condolences or clumsy congratulations. One of Emily's college friends left a laughing emoji and an offhand wow. No exclamation of gratitude came from the ones who should have offered it. I woke the next morning with a kind of rawness under my skin that felt like a bruise. The annulment of services had rung through the vendors. The florist called to confirm refund. The band confirmed their bus was packed. The bar manager texted that accounts were cleared. Each message was another, small, quiet severing. They were not dramatic acts. They were the undoing of a chain. The wedding had happened, the vows said, the photographs taken. My cancellations did not unmake the night. They altered the way the party would be cleaned up, how the receipts would balance. They shifted the cost in the ledger away from me. I drove home with the mauve dress in the back seat, folded into a laundry bag like something that had been rescued. The house smelled like the hollow warmth of mid-October, dry leaves, a lingering coffee scent, the faint ammonia of cleaner. Michael's garden outside the kitchen window had a sagging row of late roses. I promised the ones that remained a small kindness. Coming into the house felt like returning to an old stage set. The kitchen was, as always, the pivot of the home. It held the red folder Michael used to keep in his glove compartment and then on the shelf beside the toaster. The red color had always felt loud to me, a stamp of importance. I had pulled it out sometimes to pay a bill or to find a soldered note in his careful hand. I had not planned, of course, to go looking for more than dishes and quiet, but as I cleared a stack of mail from the counter, a catalog, a letter from the bank, a card with smudged handwriting, my hand grazed the red folder. It had been moved, the corner peeking out from behind a box of tea. Michael kept things where he could see them, where they would not gather dust. I almost put the folder down and went for a cup of coffee. Instead, I opened it. There were receipts, the ones I expected, and some that I did not. There was a letter folded in the way a person folds a confession, once, twice, with the edges tucked in like the corners of a child's blanket. My heart misread the shape of it at first, thinking simply of the calculus of money. I did not plan to read more than a name or a date. My fingers shook when I unfolded it. The paper had yellowed at the creases, Michael's handwriting slanting to the right in small, neat letters. The first line was ordinary enough, and then there was a sentence that stopped my breath like something slammed against a window. The words told me something about Daniel I had never expected. They were not cruel. They were a record. They were Michael telling me what he had kept in his chest for years. The sentence was precise as a surgeon's cut. Daniel is not my son. The letters that followed explained an old secret, a decision made in the quiet before our marriage, a long-ago arrangement between two people in another life. There was a reason, Michael had written, and he had believed then that revealing it would protect someone. The letter explained names, dates, and a small, polite apology tucked in to the end. I set the letter down and listened for the ordinary sounds of my house. The clock on the stove ticked. Outside, a delivery truck thumped down the block. Inside, something inside me loosened and then tightened like a muscle that had been unused. An odd calm settled over me, not the breathless kind you hear in melodramas, but a precise recognition. What I had thought of as betrayal, the dismissal at the wedding, the casual memo I had seen that winked "she'll pay," now folded into a larger geometry. Years of caretaking aimed at a man whose lineage was not quite what I'd assumed. Years of devotion invested as if into a single trunk rather than into the tree of a stranger. I did not swoon. I did not cast the papers into the fireplace. I sat at the kitchen table and reread the sentence with a clinical patience. The revelation reframed everything. It did not erase the tenderness of those late nights when a fever broke, only when my hand still held his. It did not annul the laugh that was uniquely Daniel's, the manner in which he would hum tunelessly while washing dishes. Nothing could cancel the small, certain love that had grown in me, but it reconfigured the why. It made clear that some of the expectations I had carried, the hope that my devotion would be acknowledged because of a blood tie, had been laid on a foundation I had only guessed at. You might imagine that this kind of discovery soils the past with suspicion. The collage of photographs becomes suspect, 1,000 moments rendered ambiguous. There is truth to that fear. Yet there was another reaction that surprised me, a surprising lightness, a slender freedom. If the presumed contract of blood was not the whole thing, then the wheat I'd carried for decades had been a burden of my own making. The knowledge did not make me less of a mother. It made me the author of what came next. I could have marched back to the house where the wedding had taken place, letters in hand, and demanded explanations. I could have set the red folder on the banquet table and make a scene worthy of a soap opera. I did not. That is not because I loved less. It is because, in that moment of revelation, I found a different kind of power. It was quiet, slow, and administrative, like the calls I'd made to cancel services, but richer in consequence. The choice was simple. I could continue to be the background of someone else's life, or I could become the main character of mine. I placed the letter back into the red folder with a care that felt ceremonial. I slid it between the other papers as if making a new ledger, one that accounted for truth. Then I did something else. I boxed up a handful of old photographs. Not all, not in a dramatic purge, but a small selection of images that I felt like testing. I wrapped them in butcher paper, tied them with a piece of string, and set them beside the door like a parcel waiting for the next act. It was an act of housekeeping as much as a declaration. I put the mauve dress in a sack and slung it over the back of a chair. The house felt full of potential. When you've been the caretaker of people, of homes, of traditions, you learn that the world is mostly made of small, repeated acts. Change is seldom a whirlwind. It is a sequence of decisions, each one modest in itself, that combine into something new. So I began to plan simple things. I wrote a list. Friends to call, dishes to make, a tablecloth I had been meaning to buy for years but never did because it seemed frivolous, a dinner, a real meal in my kitchen, not a buffet in a tent. I thought of Claire and Dina, of Nurse Janet who had sat with me during Michael's last hospital stay, of Mr. Henderson who had lent me a book that made me laugh until I cried. I thought of the way Carol made a gravy that tasted of memory, and Diane's relentless ability to tell the exact, honest truth. These were my people, the ones who had shown up in small, steady ways. I wanted a table that would not be merely functional, but insist that certain things be seen. There would be a sunflower-patterned cloth and roasted vegetables, a pie that was baked without apology. I wanted laughter that didn't stop because someone else needed the spotlight. I wanted the sturdy human joy that comes from bowls passed across the table and hands reaching for plates that someone else had prepared. I told myself, and some private part of me believed it, that the kitchen would be the place where I reclaimed what the wedding had taken, my center. I imagined chairs pulled close, the sound of silverware, the way light would catch on a wine glass. I did not plan the dinner as a performance against anyone. It was a promise to myself that I'd not be relegated to the background in my own home. There was more to do before the slow reconstruction could begin. There were practicalities, what to do with the flowers that had been canceled, whether to speak to Emily, whether to tell Daniel what I now knew, and when. Those were heavy stones to move, each one needing deliberation. For now, I walked around the house with the red folder under my arm and the photograph of the check saved in my phone like a tiny private talisman. I felt both lighter and more dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with a boundless clarity. That evening I called Claire. She answered on the second ring, her voice a familiar thing like a favorite book. "Margaret, how are you?" "Surviving," I said, which is how we speak when the truth is more complicated. "Come for dinner Friday. Bring that lemon tart you always do." "I'll bring the tart, you make the roast," she said, without missing a beat. "And don't you dare say you can't. You need company." I laughed because the sound was a bright asylum. "I need to be seen," I said. "Then be seen," she replied. "We'll bring the rest of the visibility." It was such a small moment, a commitment to a date, an affirmation of presence, but it made my shoulders fall away from my ears. For the first time in a long while, the house seemed hospitable not only to my past, but to my future. There are people who think power must thunder. They dream of dramatic confrontations, of speeches and slamming doors, and the cold satisfaction of a public reckoning. That is not the way this story unfolded. My reclaiming was methodical and domestic. I canceled the extensions of the wedding's conveniences. I photographed the document that proved my hand in the affair, and I began to assemble a life that would be seen on my terms. There was a strange joy in choosing a tablecloth. A day or two after the wedding, when the glow of flourishes had faded and the photographs had begun their slow trickle through social media, Daniel called. I could tell by his voice that he had been drinking, or at least riding the hanging edge of a celebration. There was a warmth to it that didn't hold the kind of softness I had once mistaken for intimacy. "Mom," he said, "you rested? You okay?" "I'm fine," I answered. Everything went as people wanted it to. A laugh that might have been a remembrance of better times. It was perfect. Emily said, "How are you two settling in?" I interrupted. The question sounded practical because it was practical. There were boxes, there were taxes, there was the hum of the real world that follows any ceremony. "We're great, Mom, real great." The certainty in his voice was a self-sufficiency that felt like lacquer. "Listen, thanks again for everything. Honestly, Emily is so happy." Gratitude without a name. "You're welcome." There was a pause. "We should come by Sunday, drop off a casserole, see you?" I felt the impulse to push, to say, where was the name at the ceremony? Why had he let me sit by the sink like a piece of furniture? Why had he allowed the joke about me being the bank? The urge to make him measure the hurt he had caused was loud and insistent, but I had a different calculus now. I had made a set of small, careful decisions. I had not burned bridges for sport. I had not turned the letters into a bonfire. I wanted a conversation that was not a plea. "Bring the casserole. Come by in the afternoon. We'll have coffee." He promised he would and hung up. I put the phone down and watched the light shift across the kitchen table. The red folder sat on the chair like an injured bird. The photograph of the check lived quietly in my phone. Somewhere in the city, probably Emily posted another photograph of her bouquet. Somewhere there were people making assumptions that had not yet been corrected because I had not yet decided how or if to correct them. I did not tell you this so you could imagine a showdown. I tell you this because the moment between revelation and action is where many women I know have lived for decades. It is the thin strip of road where you choose what kind of person you will be in the story you can still write. I had, at that kitchen table, decided to begin on a different path. I would not drag the night into a courtroom. I would not call the wedding hall and demand apologies that might not heal the long, quietly sustained assumption. I would instead do what I knew best. I would gather those who had been witnesses to me, who had been small hands at the edges of my life, and I would build a table where I would be welcome to sit at the center. The sun fell through the window in a pattern that made the dust look like a constellation on the counter. Outside, the late roses sagged their heads as if in a benediction. I made coffee, the smell taut and bitter, and I opened a notebook and wrote a list that read like a plan rather than a vow. Sort papers, call bank, schedule meeting with florist, invite friends for dinner, box photos. Each item was a small, executable task. The list felt like armor. There is a kind of power in paperwork that people rarely talk about, the way a signed letter or a checked box can turn intention into action. It is not dramatic, it is not romantic, it is the steady work of a woman who decides she will neither be erased nor perform indignity as a means to be seen. I spent the afternoon dividing photographs, setting aside the ones I could not bear to look at and the ones I wanted to keep close. I wrapped our wedding portrait, Michael and me, younger, hairless, like a different species, and set it on the mantel where it would not be surrounded by other people's history tonight. By mid-afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Daniel and Emily stood there, the bride holding a small bag with a casserole dish and a smile that had become practiced and a little brittle around the edges. "Mom," Daniel said, as if greeting a neighbor. "Come in," I said. They crossed the threshold and into my kitchen, into the place where so much of my private life had been made public and then minimized. The mauve dress was now pressed and bagged, the red folder tucked on the chair, a small domestic battlement. We embraced in a way that was appropriate and then sat at the table like people readied for dialogue. I had rehearsed nothing. I had, rather, prepared to watch and to listen and to choose when to speak. My silence was not cowardice. It was a study of the geometry of power. That geometry would shape the conversation to come. My silence was not cowardice. It had become, by the time Daniel and Emily crossed my threshold, a studied geometry, a layout of where power lay and how I might redirect it. They sat opposite me at the kitchen table in the ordinary chairs we had always used, the ones with the tiny gouges where forks and candor had scored them over the years. The red folder lay between us like a small, unblinking sun. Emily smoothed the napkin on her lap as if arranging a prop. Her bouquet was a pale thing with a few petals that drooped already. She tucked it into the passenger seat and tried to keep it crisp, the way people try to keep moments unwrinkled. Daniel sat upright, shoulders back, trying on a politeness that teetered into something brittle. He had brought a casserole, wrapped in foil, steam curled from the edges like an apology. He set it down as if it were more substantial than his words would be. I had always loved that he thought practical things could heal awkwardness. "Mom," Daniel began, as if the single noun could fill a ledger. "Sit," I said, and the single-syllable invitation was softer than the ring of a bell, but had the same authority. They did. The kitchen felt smaller with them in it, which was odd because for decades it had held whole households, homework sprawls and laundry piles, and birthdays that felt like their own kind of home. Now it hosted a different reckoning. I folded my hands over the photo on my phone, the check crisp in pixelated gray, and I placed the red folder on the table between us. "I want to understand how you both see this," I said. "Tell me, in your words, how you remember who paid for what." Daniel glanced at Emily, whose jaw tightened. She opened and closed her mouth like someone testing lace, then exhaled a practiced smile. We are grateful, really. The wedding was beautiful. Everyone said, "Gratitude is not an accounting method," I interrupted gently. "I'm asking you to tell me what you think I did." There was a pause. Daniel's face flexed with that old habit of sizing up which version of himself would work fastest: the defensive son, the charming son, the reasonable son. He chose reasonable. "You know we appreciate it. I mean, I couldn't have imagined—" "I want more than the outline of appreciation," I said. "I want to know whether you understood that most of it came from me. I want to know if you considered asking or at any point thanking me by name during the vows." He shifted. "It was the day I was thinking about—" He stopped, as if the string of reasons might tangle. "I thought you knew." There it was, the soft, careless assumption I had seen in the memo and heard in the Venmo note. "You thought I knew," I repeated. You assumed my purse was inexhaustible and my presence expendable." Daniel's eyes flashed. "That isn't fair." "Fairness lives in numerous small decisions, not in one-phrase defenses. You assumed. Someone circulated a photograph with a caption like a joke, 'His mom is covering everything,' and no one thought to ask me whether I wanted that assumption stitched into the night." Emily's hand went to her bouquet and fumbled with a stray ribbon. "Margaret, we're a married couple now. This was about us. It wasn't—" "It was about the choices you made," I said. "Choices that affected other people's resources." My voice stayed calm, not rising like a taut rope, but like a measured tide. "I can accept that you wanted a celebration. I cannot accept that you thought using my money without mention was harmless." Daniel leaned forward. "We didn't use it without mention. You knew we were planning. We talked about venues. We talked about—" "You and I never had a frank discussion about who was covering what," I said. "That's the truth. There were emails, yes, but never a sit-down where you looked me in the face and asked, 'Mary—'" I corrected myself, surprised by the name that rose like a tide. "Margaret, can you manage this, or should we scale back?' That is the conversation that never happened." He swallowed. For a moment he looked like the child I had once shushed back to sleep beside the radiator, all his bravado folded into a smaller shape. He said, "I thought you wanted this for me. I thought—" "Thoughts are not permission slips," I answered. "They don't absolve you of the labor they expect someone else to perform." Emily's posture stiffened. "Are you saying we stole from you?" "I'm saying you arranged the event with an assumption that I would bear the cost," I replied. "There is a difference between gratitude and obligation. One is given, one is expected. You chose the latter without consultation." Silence settled like the soft clap of snow. Daniel's face changed in the way my son's had when he'd first realized that his decisions had consequences outside the bubble of his own intentions. He reached for the red folder as if that could untie the knot. "What's in there?" he asked. The question had both curiosity and an edge of fear. He'd seen me open the folder that day when I'd returned home. He had not seen what I had done with its contents since. "Receipts, invoices, letters." I pushed the folder across the table toward him. "This is your archive now." He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside were monthly statements, copies of canceled checks, the photocopy of the bank deposit I had made, the invoice from the caterer with my name beneath the amount, the photograph of the check. My hand brushed over the soft, reconciled paper and saw the small fossil of our life with Michael. I had arranged everything with care after my husband died, the way someone tends a garden after a storm. I had kept records not out of malice, but out of respect for the life we'd built. His fingers trembled when he pulled out the letter, the yellowed page from Michael. His face turned the color of the tomatoes on the jar on my counter. "You kept this?" he said, voice small as glass. "I read it," I said. "It told me something I already suspected in pieces, that your paternity was not what I'd believed. Michael told me why. He thought he was protecting you and me back then from whatever a different truth might have invited. He told me things in his way, tidy, painful, apologetic. I kept the letter because you should know what he knew. I kept it because I needed to decide what the knowledge asked of me." Daniel looked as if the floor beneath him had softened. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I wanted to choose my moment. Because secrets can be weapons and confessions like bombs. I wanted to be able to hold you afterward. I wanted you to have a chance to be who you are without the sudden collapse of being told in front of others." He closed his eyes. For a brief stretch, the years Hannah had described of childhood stitches and midnight fevers rearranged themselves into a new shape. Something about him, the way his mouth held back a cry, the way his fingers fluttered on the paper, made me remember nights when he was small and feverish and I had watched his chest rise. Those were not lies. Those were not any less real. "Do you understand?" I asked finally, "that my acceptance of you has never been contingent on a blood test? That I loved the person who grew into Daniel long before any label could explain him?" He opened his eyes. "I do," he said in a voice that sounded like someone rediscovering a language. "I do, but, Mom, if you'd known, what would you have done differently?" I interrupted. That was the fulcrum. My question was not rhetorical. I wanted to see what he might construct when he could no longer lean on assumptions. He swallowed again and then said slowly, "I think I would have recognized you more. I would have said your name in the vows." "Words don't make the entire ledger," I said, "but they are part of the ledger. A name once spoken in recognition changes the bookkeeping of a life." Emily shifted her weight, the small metallic click of a bracelet catching sun. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "Margaret, You didn't mean to," I repeated. "Intent and impact are different things. I am not cataloging malice. I am cataloging absence of conversation, of names, of acknowledgement." The conversation circled in this way for a while, with Daniel trying to find the right phrase to reassure me, Emily trying to pluck the frayed etiquette of new marriage and lay it over the ragged edges left in the wake. I listened. I corrected where I needed to and left silence where silence fit. At one point, Daniel reached across the table and laid his hand over mine, a gesture that felt like someone tacking a kiss to a contract. "Take the box," I said. "Take these papers. Keep them. Learn, then decide whether you want a mother who will continue to be a safety net for anything you assume I will cover." He looked wounded at my phrasing, as if I had invented a law he had broken without knowing. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm asking you to look at the materials and then make a choice," I clarified. "I will offer you a relationship that is honest and reciprocal. I will not be a silent sponsor to assumptions. If you cannot accept that, then perhaps space is necessary." Emily's face pinched. "Margaret, you are not being fair." "Fairness is not my job as a mother," I said. "My job has been to guide, to teach, to love. I'm offering you an education in respect now." Daniel stood up then. Anger and shame and grief swirled in a way that made his movements clumsy. He picked up the red folder, the photographs, the invoices, the letter. He had always handled documents with a reverence close to superstition. For a second he looked like a man carrying something too large for his arms. He did not slam the door when he left. He left quietly, as if the air itself had asked him to go. Emily hesitated in the doorway, then followed. They pulled the front door closed with barely a click. I sat at the table afterward until the house had reset itself into the slow, habitual noises of an evening. The kettle sang, the clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed. My hands did not tremble. I felt no giddy triumph.
I felt a calmness, like a wood smoke that had finally found its chimney. The folder sat on the counter. The mauve dress, still bagged in the laundry sack, hung on the back of a chair like a memory in transit. In the days that followed, I moved through small chores with a new intention. I made calls I had been putting off, to the bank to confirm the deposits, to the accountant to ask about transferring certain bills out of our joint account into a separate one that protected my savings. I wrote a list of what to do with the photographs, which to keep framed, which to box, which to mail to those who might want them. Each item felt like laying one brick down for a new, quieter structure. I shopped for the dinner with the precise kind of eagerness that arrives when a person decides to cultivate joy, not as compensation, but as a daily choice. The sunflower cloth I had latched onto in my mind was real enough in the shop, a riot of yellow and blue that felt almost impertinent beside the navy towels and muted linens. I bought it with a small thrill, paying in cash because some things return pleasure when they are tactile rather than digital. I bought rosemary to tie to the roast, lemons for the tart Claire insisted on bringing, and a bottle of wine that had a label showing a simple field. I came home carrying the smell of the market, ripe tomatoes, basil such as perfume, and felt the house inhale like an animal finding its owner. When Friday arrived, my kitchen prepared itself for company like a polite guest. I polished the silverware until it answered the light. I set the table with plates I had rescued from a yard sale in the spring, heavy, imperfect things with a hairline fracture on a rim that made them feel like survivors. I lit a candle in the center and placed the sunflower cloth beneath it. The mauve dress was folded into a drawer, not hidden but not displayed, a presence like an older friend who knew the jokes you no longer needed to say aloud. Claire arrived first, hugging me as if she were squeezing the shape of my ribs into a more manageable form. "Margaret," she said, "you're glowing. The house smells dangerous." I made coffee. The roast will not combust, I promise. Dina came in with a bottle of a vinegar-based relish that she swore carried the emotional equilibrium of her childhood, and Nurse Janet arrived with a plate of cookies she had only partially eaten because someone had made an emergency telephone call and required her attentions halfway through baking. Mr. Henderson shuffled in with a battered paperback under his arm, the spine broken in exactly the right place. Carol and Diane rounded out the room, voices already overlapping in a steady, comfortable friction. They were the people who had been at my edges, not the ones to grandstand, but the ones who, like good soil, made growth possible.
We prepared the dinner together in that easy way people do who have eaten and apologized and mended and celebrated together for years. Claire took charge of the salad, tossing greens with a ferocity that made lettuce look like it had confessed a wrongdoing. Dina basted the roast with rosemary so that the house began to smell like the furthermost memory of a Sunday afternoon. Nurse Janet fussed with the tart until its lemon smell cut through the rosemary and made everyone smile. We moved through the evening with the kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with the spectacle of the wedding and everything to do with steady presence. There were stories traded not as performance, but as offerings. Mr. Henderson read a paragraph from the battered paperback about a woman who reinvented herself after an unkind marriage. Claire told a story about a time she'd accidentally worn 2 different shoes to work and how it had launched an entire office day of laughter. Dina roasted my habit of never ordering anything extravagant for myself, which made me shove a fork into the roast in mock indignation. At some point, the conversation turned, as conversations at such tables do, from small talk to testimony. Jane from the church said quietly that her husband had left 10 years ago, and she had spent 3 years building a life of her own that she called the deliberate smallness. Nurse Janet spoke about the way she'd seen people become more themselves after losing a role that had been weighed down by expectations. The laughter rose and fell. Plates were cleared and replaced. Someone asked for more gravy. Someone else asked whether the lemon tart could be cut into fifths instead of quarters because Diane had sworn it was the only dessert she would allow in the house. The mention of the wedding circulated like a breeze, but no one tried to blow it into a gale. Toward the end of the night, glasses half full and plates almost clean, I rose. The old ritual muscles in my chest learned how to stand and hold attention. The women turned to me with the kind of quiet curiosity that welcomes a word without needing to make a spectacle. "I'd like to say something," I started. My voice was the voice of someone who had rehearsed nothing but had found clarity in the doing. "Tonight, I wanted to be with people who know me for who I am, not for what anyone else assumed I'd be." Claire clapped her hands like a child. "Finally," she said with a grin. I spent 10 days of my life writing lists and making calls and folding photographs. I canceled things carefully, not to punish, but to stop fueling an expectation I had not agreed to. I found a letter that changed how I understood parts of my life. I could have made that letter a weapon. Instead, I made it a ledger. The room hummed with the self-evident. Someone raised a glass. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "To the ledger," he said, with a smile imperceptibly crinkling his eyes. "To the ledger," everyone echoed, and the word landed with the common sense of landing things. The glasses chimed. Then Claire, with the untempered earnestness I'd always loved, lifted her glass higher. "To choosing yourself," she said, "to making a table where you finally sit at the head." "To choosing yourself," the room answered again, this time with more heat. It was not a rebuke against those absent. It was a declaration for the living. I felt the phrase settle like a new fabric around my shoulders. We ate the pie to the crumbs and cleared the plates and talked until the clock decided we had been good keepers of our time. At the end, as people prepared to leave, Claire kissed my cheek and said with that fierce tenderness she'd always had, "If he comes back and knocks, you don't have to pick the door up immediately. Let it be on his side this time." "Let it be on his side," I repeated. The sentence sat in my chest like a comfortable, unusual garment. The evening allowed me to imagine a future I had not been brave enough to articulate the week before. The table, decked in sunflowers and lit by a single candle, felt less like a refutation and more like an inauguration. The friends lingered with the ease of those who do not fear the small silences that follow good company. They hugged me at the door, promising to call, to come by, to bring me soup should sorrow find me. They meant it. I believed them. In the days that followed, there were gestures, trivial and profound. A neighbor returned a pan I'd borrowed with a note that said, "Your kitchen smells like someone who finally decided to write her own recipe." The bank called to confirm that transfers had been completed. A message came from someone at the wedding, not from Daniel or Emily, but from a cousin who had remembered that I had once mended a bridesmaid's dress with 2 safety pins and a prayer. "I'm sorry you felt invisible," she wrote. "I should have said your name." The message read like a small first aid. There were also moments of awkwardness. A birthday invitation arrived addressed generically to the Hunter family, as if our family were an undifferentiated unit. I let some things slide. There were other things I did not let slide. When calls came with requests that required money on the spur of the moment, I paused now. I asked questions. I practiced the unfamiliar art of saying, "I'll think about it," which is a sentence I had rarely used in the currency of parenthood. One evening, not long after the dinner, Daniel knocked on the back door. I was in the kitchen, seated at the small breakfast nook with my mug of coffee, the mauve dress tucked into a drawer nearby like a letter I'd read and closed. The red folder sat on the counter, its contents thinned by the handing over, but still present. He stood on the back step with uncertain posture, a human imbalance I recognized. "May I come in?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Sit." He came in and sat across from me, unshaven in that way which, for a moment, made him look younger. The house smelled faintly of rosemary because I'd roasted something small for myself that afternoon. We did not begin with the heavy things. Instead, we watched the way steam curled from our cups. "I'm sorry," he said after a time, the words lived in for a while before being set free. "For assuming, for not saying your name, for thinking—" He stopped, looking at the mug like it might offer a map. "I don't need to hear a linear apology," I said. "You show me change. Apologies are stitches. Actions are fabric." He nodded. "I read the letters. I read everything in the folder." He placed both palms flat on the table as if to steady himself. "I didn't know. I was angry at first because I thought you'd kept something from me. Then I read and it made sense in a way, not in the way that excuses, but in the way that explains." "Explaining is a doorway," I said. "It does not remove the work, but it opens the possibility. I don't want to be the son who sits in the audience applauding your absence. I want to be someone who says your name, who pays his own checks, who shows up." Those words settled in me like the first rain after a drought. I did not promise instant reconciliation. I did not declare the ledger healed, but I accepted the shape of his effort. "Then show me," I said. "Begin by not making assumptions about resources. Begin by naming the people who have helped you. Begin by being present." He reached across the table and opened his hand, which had once held a child's scabbed knee and a teenager's misplaced passport. In his palm, he cupped an old photograph he had taken from the folder, a picture of his 10th birthday, frosting on his lip, eyes bright with the kind of joy that made a mother glow. He set it gently in front of me. "I want to be in your life," he said, "on different terms." "Then be," I said. We did not rush into forgiveness as if it were a garment to be put on quickly. We negotiated the small terms, a boundary about money, a plan for regular visits that were not organized around holidays where expectations crowded in like relatives, a commitment to openness. There would be mistakes, of course, there would be stumbles, but there was also the practical grace of two people trying to make a map where one had been drawn assuming too much. There came mornings, after all, that felt deliciously ordinary. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the red folder closed but within reach, the mauve dress a silent witness in the drawer. The roses outside the back window had found a small second wind, their heads perked like faces in polite conversation. The sun came in soft as a blessing, and the air smelled faintly of mown grass. I would step out onto the porch with my cup and watch the neighborhood wake up. A child on a bicycle, neighbors pretending not to notice each other yet smiling secretly.
It was not the sweeping victory I'd been expecting when the check photo went up on my little social feed. It was better, in the slow way life sometimes is, incremental, honest. Sometimes I would scroll through my phone and find the picture of the check and smile at the memory of that crisp documentation. The photograph had been a quiet statement, not a fanfare. It had been proof for myself that I had not been invisible entirely. It had been a ledger entry that said I existed in the bookkeeping of this life. Having made that point, I no longer needed to wave it like a flag. The image sat like a bookmark. The story did not require constant retelling. On one such morning, as I prepared to water the roses, the thought came to me with the slow humility of an old tune. Staying quiet at the wedding had been a strategy, not because I had no words, but because words alone would have consumed the night and turned the center on me in a way that might have complicated the way Daniel and Emily began. I had chosen to witness, to gather evidence, to shape my next steps deliberately. The silence had been a careful reserve. It had allowed me to leave space for a later, more precise intervention. It had allowed me to preserve my dignity while arranging a future where my presence could be requested rather than assumed. The roses bent under the weight of their own late buds, and I bent to the watering can as if to bless them. A neighbor's dog barked, someone down the street swept their porch, and the world moved on. For a long while I'd worn my identity like a shadow, following behind roles others had sketched for me. That morning I felt the space in front of me widen. It felt possible to step into it. Years are not rewritten by single acts alone. They are rewritten by small decisions strung like beads. There will be days when I will still be tempted to shrink. There will be days when the old reflex to take care and to absorb will pull at me. The difference now is a muscle I have been teaching myself to use, the muscle of saying no when needed, of asking plainly when a debt is expected, of accepting who I am without seeking an audience to validate it. I have found, in the doing, a gentle ferocity that is not about smashing others, but about protecting the shape of my life. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the kitchen that night, the squeak of the folding chair, the paper cups of shrimp cocktail, the swinging door that let in the warm lights of a celebration I had paid for. I remember how I breathed through the sliver of hurt, how I let myself be the grown-up who could hold rage without letting it become the performance on someone else's stage. I stayed quiet that night for a reason, to choose my words and my actions later, when they would matter more than a single scene. I stayed quiet not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted the next chapter to be written deliberately.
If this story touches something you understand, the odd grammar of giving until you are invisible, the slow work of reclaiming, tell me where you're watching from. Share in the comments if you have a moment when quiet became strategy for you. Your voice matters, and in the telling, we find a table to sit at together. Some mornings now, the light comes across the table in a way that makes my mug glow. The roses outside the kitchen window lift their faces to it. I drink my coffee slowly, and the house feels at last like a place I do not have to justify being in. The folding chair is still in the garage. Sometimes I sit in it for the sheer, stubborn humor of remembering how small things can hold big moments. The mauve dress is worn sometimes for no reason other than that I like the way it moves when I turn. The red folder is a record, not a weight. The photograph of the check lives in my phone like a small, unassuming truth. I am, finally, visible in my own life, and that visibility is both a gift and a responsibility to myself most of all.